Hello everybody, this is another video in the PHP series. In this one we'll talk about variables. We'll begin with a question. What are variables and why do we need them? Imagine we have a site like this and this is a product detail page. Every product has a name, a description and a price. Now imagine we have hundreds of products in our eShop. If we know only HTML, we would need to create hundreds of HTML pages, each with a different content. If we know PHP, this is different. All we need to do is create a template with the placeholders, and in these placeholders we'll echo variables. Example of one variable can be a product name, another variable can be a product price. Another advantage is that if we add a product, with HTML we would need to create one more HTML page, but with PHP we don't have to do it, we need to create only one more database record. Okay, I think it's time to do some real work with variables. To demonstrate this, we will turn this HTML page into PHP with some content replaced by PHP variables. First, open this HTML page in NetBeans, and you see it's just plain HTML. First thing that we'll do, we'll create a new PHP file and name it productdetail.php. Then we'll copy all this content inside product detail page, save the file and open it in a browser. You already know you have to go to localhost, which is inside your htdocs directory, then the subdirectory php intro and productdetail.php that we just created. Let's introduce our first variable. For example, we can define a product name. The only condition here is that if we want to use our variable, it has to be defined before the actual use. So above the h1 tag, we'll insert opening and closing PHP tags and insert our first variable. A variable has to start with a dollar symbol. Then you can write any letters, numbers, and an underscore. The only rule here is that the variable name has to start with a letter or an underscore. It cannot start with a number. Then we'll insert our product name and end the line with a semicolon. Our variable is defined now. We can use it if we delete this text inside h1 element, write opening and closing PHP tags, and echo the variable here. Save the page, refresh the browser, and our variable is right here. Nothing is changed at the moment because the product name is the same. We can make a little test. We can change the content of the variable, and when we save the source code and refresh the browser, you can see that the product name has changed. This was an example of a string variable. String variables are used for storing an ordinary text. PHP defines more types of variables, for example integer, float, boolean, arrays, or objects. In this lesson, I want to focus only on the basic variables so you know how to use them, and later we will learn other variable types. Let's move on and define a float variable. They are used for storing decimal numbers. A good example is a price. So we can define a price as 7.90. You can see that float variables are defined by a decimal point. Then we change the fixed price and replace it with our price variable. Save the source code, refresh the browser, and you might have noticed that the price has changed and the zero has been cut away. This is because the price is not a string anymore, but a float value. Later we will learn how we can convert this price back to string, so we will also see the zero. Another variable type that we'll use often is an integer type. And for example, we can define a quantity variable and assign it a value of 5. And we can echo this variable as a value of the input. When we save the source code and refresh the browser, you can see that 1 has been replaced by 5. These were the 3 basic variable types that we'll use often, and that was a string variable defined by quotes, a float variable defined as a decimal number, and an integer variable type. Okay, now we know how to define a variable and echo a variable. But with variables, we can also do operations. There are more types of operations, and we'll learn how to do mathematical operations with numbers and string manipulations. First, we'll start with strings. We'll define a new variable called str1, and the content of this variable will be this is the beginning of a string. Then we'll define another string variable, and the content will be I will be added after the first string. Let's insert a new div element just below our description, and now I will show you how to concatenate two strings. We'll write echo, the first variable, then the dot symbol, which means concatenate, and str2. When we refresh the browser, you will see the two sentences right here. We can also add a string between these two variables with another dot operator, and inside this clause there will be a hyphen, and when we save the source code and refresh the browser, you can see the changed string here. Pretty easy, right? We can move on to some operations with integer variables. We can do all kinds of mathematical operations. For example, we can define a new integer variable called int and assign it 4 plus 1. When we echo the variable in the browser, you will see that there will be 5. It's right here in the end of this line. We can even concatenate another string, which will be an HTML line break, and now the 5 will be shown on a separate line. We can do other mathematical operations like minus. Now it will be 3. We can multiply the numbers. 4 times 2 is 8. We can also do divisions. 4 divided by 2 is 2. And we can even combine more numbers together. 4 times 2 plus 1 is 9. There is the same operation precedence than in the real math, and if you don't remember it, you can always change the precedence with parentheses. Now it's 4 times 3, because 2 plus 1 is 3, which is 12. Until now we worked with the whole numbers. Now I will show you what happens if you divide 7 by 2. The result will be 3.5. Now it's a good time to explain you what a modulo operator means. A modulo operator is defined by a percent symbol, and if we write 7% 2, the result will be 1. A modulo operator means the remainder of the division. The result is 1 because 2 times 3 is 6, and we have 1 left. In other words, 2 is contained 3 times in 7, but we still have 1 as the remainder. Let's delete this content now and define int as 8. Now I will show you a cool thing about PHP. Sometimes it's needed to increment an integer value by 1. There are more ways how to achieve this. The simplest thing would be to write int equals int plus 1. But we want to be cool PHP programmers, right? So we can take advantage of double plus operator. First echo this int so that we'll see what is inside. And in the second line, write echo int double plus. And in the third line, just echo int. The first row should result in 8, the second row also in 8, and the third row in 9. Why is it so? In the first row, there is nothing new. In the second row, there is double plus operator, which means echo the variable and increment it by 1. But it first echoes the variable, which is 8, and then increments it. In the third row is the new value already. However, if we change this and write the double plus operator in front of int, it will be different. Now the result will be 9 in the second row, and the reason is because the variable is first incremented and then printed. And this is how it looks in the browser. Okay, we already know some basic operations with variables. Now is the time to talk about changing of variable types. First, I like to introduce a PHP function called vardump, which prints information about a variable. It takes one parameter, which is a variable. So if we write vardump int, it will print out information about the int variable, which is integer type, and the value is 8. Let's multiply the int value by 2. We can either write int equals int times 2 or a shortcut int star equals 2. Now vardump the information about the variable. We see it's still integer and 16. However, what happens if we multiply it by a decimal number 2.5? You see, the type has changed to float and the value is 20. Let's divide the variable by the same number by 2.5. Vardump the variable, and the result is 8 again, but this time it's a float. We can explicitly say that we want this variable to be an integer variable. We can do it by int keyword, so we write int equals int in parentheses and int variable. Let's vardump this new int variable. You see, it's an integer variable now. With the whole numbers, it works perfectly good. Now I will show you what happens if we try to change the type of a float variable, which is a decimal number. Let's comment out these 4 lines and multiply the variable by 2.1. It's 16.8. Now change the type of this variable, and you see it's an integer variable now, but the value is 16, not 16.8. What happened here is that if you use the int keyword, the PHP parser takes only 16 and cuts away the decimal part. Therefore, it's important that you know what you are doing when you change the variable types. Working with variables might be pretty dangerous, and you might not always know what type your variable is. PHP gives you the absolute freedom of what you assign to your variable. I will give you an example. Suppose you have a variable called myvar and you assign a number 10. Later in the program, you change your mind and you decide to assign a string to your variable, and the string will be elephant. So what is inside your variable now? Is it a number? Is it a string? If we var dump it and look at it in the browser, we'll see that it's a string and the content is elephant. Once again, PHP gives you the absolute freedom, but with the freedom comes the responsibility. If you want to make minimum mistakes and play nice with others, you should always name your variables with descriptive names. For example, a variable named price should always contain a decimal number, or a variable named description should always carry a string with a description of a product. This way, if someone else looks at your code later, they can always pretty much guess what's inside your variables and they can continue in your project. Some programmers might complain that PHP is a stupid language, that it lets you assign variables as you want, but I personally like it. Okay, now we know how to change the variable type to integer by int keyword. But int is not the only type that we can change our variable type to. For example, we can define a float variable with the content of 14.55. Now it's a float, and we can change it to string by a string keyword. If we var dump it, now we'll see that it's a string with the value of 14.55. Then we can change it to int by int keyword. Once again, it cuts away the decimal part. And of course, we can also change string back to float by float keyword, and it's back to 14.55 and a float. You can play with the variables however you want, just make sure you know what you're doing. Except for variables, PHP also works with constants. A constant is a value that doesn't change throughout the program. We can declare a constant by a defined function. The first parameter is the name of the constant, which should be a descriptive name, and it's recommended that it's always written in capital letters. The second parameter is the value of the constant, and it can be any primitive type, for example a string, an integer, a float, or a boolean. Alright, you cannot change me. First, let's echo the constant. Now we can see the text in the browser. I told you we cannot change the content of the constant. If we try to do it, NetBeans will underline it in red. Also, if we save the source code, you will get a parse error in the browser. So, this is impossible. The last thing I will show you in this video is what happens when you try to use a variable that you haven't defined before. For example, let's comment out the price, refresh the browser, and now you see I got a notice. It depends on your PHP settings what you'll see in your browser, but most likely you will either see the same notice that you tried to use an undefined variable, or you will see nothing at all. So you always have to keep in mind that if you want to use a variable, you have to define it before. Okay, I think it was enough of talking about the variables for this lesson. I'd like to summarize what we've learned in this lesson. We've learned that variables make it possible to dynamically change the content on our page. We know how to define variables, and we worked with three basic variable types that are strings, integers, and float variables. We can do basic operations with numbers, and we can concatenate two strings. We also know that PHP gives us the absolute freedom in what we do with our variables, and it's our responsibility to choose descriptive names so that other people can easily continue in our work.